Hello and welcome to the past 100 years. Today we're going to look back at the past century leading up to 2120. Personally, I thought it would make more sense looking forward to the next 100 years to 2220, but this is just what I was asked to do. So in the spirit of the event, I've dressed up in traditional garb from 2020. In order to understand what the world is like today in the year 2120, I want you to understand what the world was like in 2020. So let's take a stroll. The world in 2020 had evolved over the previous decades. Space exploration had seen man first land on the moon on July 20th, 1969 with the landing of Apollo 11. But it was the product of the Cold War and a space race between the world's two nuclear superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And space, the first utility, was a show of power, a display of power in a way to establish dominance over another power without resorting to the use of weapons of mass destruction. By the early 2000s, space had evolved, and with the détente of the Cold War, space had evolved into other uses. Space for science, space for telecommunications, and the playing field in space exploration was dominated by what we call the Big Five. The European Space Agency, the Canadian Space Agency, NASA, Roscosmos, the Russian Space Agency, and JAXA, the Japanese Space Agency. By 2020, it was becoming apparent, however, that there was more to space than just militaristic displays of dominance and technological prowess. And it was with the advent of satellites for telecommunications, satellites for Earth observation, satellite for migration, tracking migration patterns, disease, populations of endangered species, it became clear that access to space was tantamount with empowerment. And by 2020, the landscape of space agencies had evolved from two superpowers in the 1950s to five major players in the early 2000s to a landscape of space agencies of 40 plus in 2020, including space agencies for Brazil, Greece, India, China, Singapore, South Korea, and more. Emerging superpowers like India had planned their first unmanned sojourns to Mars and the Moon, and by the early 2020s were planning their first human-class exploration missions. Humanity as a whole was looking forward as international collaborators to go forward to the Moon, to return there, to stay there, and use it as a springboard to Mars and beyond to the stars. Starting with the Lunar Gateway, a lunar orbiter in orbit around the Moon, and looking forward with the Artemis project, proposed by NASA in 2019 to put humans on the Moon and the first woman on the Moon by 2024. Humans alive in the year 2020 meant that there were 20-year-olds who had never known a world without a continuously crewed off-world space station. There were 25-year-olds alive who never knew a world without exoplanets, who never knew a world in which we wondered, is there more beyond our solar system? This was the state of human space exploration by 2020, including satellites, rovers, robotic missions to any place in the solar system. In 2020, we had sent probes to within Saturn's rings and imaged the rings from the inside for the first time. And we had sent, that was with the Cassini probe, and different space agencies had successfully landed on asteroids. JAXA with the Hayabusa lander, and the European Space Agency with the Philae Rosetta mission. And it wasn't just the major space agencies. Commercial space players were getting up in the space game as well. In 2016, Elon Musk started the next space race to Mars, announcing that by the 2020s, he would land humans on Mars to stay, to settle, and to live beyond generations. Not to be outdone, Boeing said it would beat SpaceX to Mars. Elsewhere in the commercial space sector, suborbital flight was really taking off, if you know what I'm saying. And in 2019, SpaceX launched its first commercial supply vehicle by way of the Falcon 9 rocket to the International Space Station. And not to be outdone, Virgin Galactic launched the world's first commercial female astronaut, Beth Moses, to space in March of 2019. Aiming for the moon, truly, the world's first private billionaire signed up with SpaceX to put humanity back to the moon in the commercial sphere and signed up with the Dear Moon plan. This was a little bit derailed when it emerged that this artist's plan to bring art and humanity back to the moon was also waylaid a little bit by his secret plan to find a girlfriend to bring the moon with him. Elsewhere, citizen scientist astronaut candidates like myself jumped on this increased access to space and took advantage of the suborbital sector to test spacesuits. Test spacesuits for crash landing scenarios, test spacesuits in zero gravity, all with the hopes of making it to space with suborbital commercial flights. Finally, private philanthropists like the millionaires launched the Breakthrough Starshot project. Yuri Milner and his wife Julia announced $100 million in funding over 10 years for SETI to look for life elsewhere in the universe, starting with one of their most ambitious goals, sending a fleet of nano-powered solar sails powered by lasers to accelerate at 1/5 of the speed of light, hoping to get to our nearest neighbor, the Proxima Alpha Centauri star system at 4.3 light years away, where it was known that there were rocky exoplanets, like our own, Earth-like planets, in the hope of discovering friends and neighbors beyond our solar system. In 2020, we held in our palms, in these external brain devices that we then called smartphones, more computing power in our hands than all of NASA had in their computation devices when they sent men to the moon in 1969. Elsewhere in technology, in 2020, companies like Aeromobile were proposing the world's first hybrid flying cars that could drive on Earth and fly up in the air. Humans were experimenting with early forms of telekinesis by using transcranial magnetic devices to enact the motor cortex to force a human to be forced to perform an action across distances. Back to the Future fans had their heyday when the first hoverboard came out. And companies, back to SpaceX, were experimenting with better, faster transportation from Hyperloop to point-to-point suborbital flight. That was the world in 2020. You could 3D print anything. You could 3D print food, 3D print for food, 3D print for space, 3D print for tissue and organ creation. We had some progress on the human rights fronts as well. There was some progress with legalization of gay marriage across Europe and North America and Australia. Nigeria finally banned female genital mutilation, and the United States followed a little bit later. Which is not to say that the world was perfect in 2020. There was still considerable equity between the sexes, equity disparities between the sexes. Being born with the chromosomes XX could mean that you were simply not paid the same amount for equal work, that you were maybe denied the access to the same education, and depending on where you were born, sometimes even denied you the right to live. In 2020, people were still denying whether climate change was real, and I guess we know how that turned out. And then things got weird. By 2020, that long, slow evolutionary march that we long thought had suspected was happening, but we're never really quite sure was happening, finally came true, and the iPad and the iPhone became the same device. And then things escalated. It started with an unfortunate tweet between one ornery and brash head of state saying something particularly unfortunate about another ornery and brash head of state's mother, which was misinterpreted. And that was the beginning of the Third World War. Of course, throwing it back to history, this played out much like previous shows of power, with one power escalating and then backing down. And suddenly, in order to protect humanity, but also to show a display of dominance and force over the other powers, each of the world's superpowers that were spacefaring, from the USA to China to Mexico to Syria to Iran, expanded the world war to a sphere in which it had never been seen before: space. And I guess the use of Space Force was finally justified. Scintillating armadas of spacecraft would light up the night sky, and the countries below would live in fear, wondering if that night would be their last. But alas, in a ramp, there would be this constant ramp up, and suddenly realizing what the display of nuclear power in space would mean for humanity, the aggressors would back down at the last minute. This went on for 2 years until 2022, until the heads of states of all involved realized that this could no longer continue and called a global summit. And it finally took Canada sitting back most of the time, standing up at this global summit, forcing a strongly worded rebuke, saying, "I'm a little upset," for the heads of state of all the world's major countries and power players to take a step back and realize the magnanimity and the gravity of what they were proposing should the Third World War continue. And that was the beginning of the détente and the de-escalation of the Third World War. And what had gone on for 3 years prior was resolved through diplomacy. And just like the Second World War before it had propelled, literally, humanity to the stars with the advent of ballistic missiles for rocketry, and just like von Braun's inventions in the Second World War propelled us literally to the stars and to the moon, so did the transportation advances during the Third World War propel advances in transportation on Earth. The year 2024 in Europe saw the establishment of the world's first three-dimensional power grid, and suddenly films like The Fifth Element and The Jetsons became a reality. Meanwhile, across the pond, for the first time in 2024, the sale of autonomous vehicles surpassed the sale of human-driven cars. And suddenly it was possible to drive to work, read a book, have a nap, finish your work, and if you own the deluxe model, have your workout too. The advances in suborbital spaceflight also benefited from the Third World War. And commercial companies like Virgin Galactic and SpaceX, which had previously suffered and been on hiatus during this three-year world strife, suddenly became reality. And commercial spaceflight and space tourists finally flew for the first time in 2025, opening up the space sphere to tourists and non-pilots and astronauts for the first time. In 2026, the International Space Station was finally officially decommissioned, but sold to a private buyer. And that's how the world's first space hotel was established. And that was the beginning. That was the beginning of the advent of second-generation astronauts. Previously, where space had been for pilots and scientists and researchers, space is now suddenly accessible to astronauts, or to artists and dancers and creators and entrepreneurs, and suddenly it was possible to literally be dancing with the stars. And of course, Hollywood followed suit. And where in true tradition, Hollywood had previously spent billions of dollars rescuing Matt Damon in the movies, reality finally came in, fiction finally turned into reality as Matt Damon was filming outside a space station one day. His umbilical cord was severed, and he went rushing off into the vacuum of space. And yet again, America spent $1 billion rescuing Matt Damon from space. In 2033, the Artemis program through NASA, which had obviously been delayed by the Third World War, finally came to fruition in a strange kind of way, as a private artist went with a commercial provider in this topsy-turvy topsy-turvy turn of events. And that's how, we all remember it, I don't need to go into the details. And that's how amazing Artemis, the artist, went with Amazon on her amazing adventure to the moon. By 2038, we had established permanent surface operations on the moon and used that as a test bed and a springboard to go to Mars. And by 2039, the Chinese space station, which had been in orbit around Earth since a decade prior, finally fulfilled Arthur C. Clarke's long ago prophecy, and without warning one day suddenly took off for Mars, spurring the next great space race. But it was what happened next that is a true testament to humanity. For when the Chinese space station became locked in orbit through a transportation malfunction, and uttered an international interplanetary distress signal, humanity banded together and went on a rescue mission, the likes of which had never been previously seen. And together, they made the bold decision to continue on down to the surface of Mars. And it was linked arm in arm that the world's major space agency astronauts, China, Canada, USA, India, Russia, Brazil, and Nigeria, took their first steps as a human race and uttered those now famous words, "Together we achieve." And that was the beginning of permanent operations on Mars. Mars allowed us a springboard to the stars, and by 2052, the first interplanetary asteroid mining company struck gold, literally, and suddenly precious metals like titanium and gold and diamonds became as ubiquitous as aluminum, empowering humanity's manufacturing capabilities, and suddenly these metals were no longer lacking. Which isn't to say that all was well. Meanwhile, back on Earth, climate change came right on cue. The world's population reached 10 billion people, far ahead of schedule from the year 2100 as predicted. And in 2059, we reached a turning point. The ice caps melted, the ocean levels rose, the polar bears drowned. And that's when the Fourth World War began, over scarcity, over a resource that was once plentiful, over water. This was the world in 2069, spurring a decades-long war as what was once plentiful, land, clean water, and physical objects were fought over. And finally, the scientists took the lead, stood up and said, "You have to listen." They may or may not have thrown a told you so in there. They said, "Look, if we don't work together now, then we as a species are finished." And in pulling the undergraduate equivalent of an all-nighter in 15 years, banded together using ingenuity and innovation to solve all of the world's problems, where there was now no longer previously any physical space, we made space. We colonized the ocean floors, we built vertical buildings high up into the sky, and suddenly the world looked very much like the Jetsons. There was no land for our agriculture, so we took a concept of the early 21st century vertical farming, and suddenly that was the only way to farm. We finally cracked the nut of achieving large-scale mass desalination, and once again, water was no longer a scarce commodity. Finally banding together, all of the world's major nations issued a worldwide moratorium on any type of fossil fuels. And it was okay, because suddenly we had wind, solar, hydroelectric, geothermal, nuclear, algal, and bioethanol fuels to rely on. This also marked the shift of a transition in the currencies that we used. I mean, it had all been Bitcoin anyway since the 2030s, but now the only way to trade resources was in terms of creativity, return to society, or units of energy. Physical objects went the way of the dinosaur, and the world suddenly became very based in AR and VR technologies. And that's how 50 Shades of Grey ended up in the Louvre. Elsewhere, Through all of this, we had achieved the homeostasis in humanity, having solved some major problems. But all in all, it cost us was the world's panda bears, polar bears, giraffes, sharks, dolphins, whales, koala bears. But I guess there was a silver lining, because the mosquitoes went too. Meanwhile, in the world of medicine, we continue to make advances. By the year 2035, HIV/AIDS was only seen in history books. By 2043, cancer followed suit. And finally, by the year 2060, so too did we cure the common cold. In 2063, the Nobel Prize went to the doctor who finally figured out to make a way to have babies born with instruction manuals. In 2071, medicine was living in a golden age, and humans suddenly were pushing the limits. Suddenly it was possible to go see your doctor for a prescription for human enhancement as well. Suddenly you could ask for health strength, super speed, or photographic memory. Of course, it wasn't cheap, and this began the great divide between hybrids and non-hybrids. In 2091, artificial intelligence jumped into the fray and also wanted to be part of this race disparity, but also fought for the right to marry humans, whether hybrid or not. And it was like the gay marriage debate of the early 2010s all over again, and some of us asking, for the love of God, why is this happening? And then, of course, there was Y2K 99, when we suddenly realized that we had forgotten to address that problem of a century past, and there was brief panic when we thought that not having 4-year digits might send us back into the era of 1999, pre-smartphones, pre-artificial intelligence, but it all worked out and we were able to party like it was 2099. By 2108, government was global, but not yet interplanetary, and advertisements, images, information, email, and communication was directly beamed to your brain. By 2108, it was only possible to make a living as a creative for trading energy, whereas it never had worked, because bot help you, all the other jobs belong to the robots, and help you if you try to take their jobs, because they had darn good unions. In 2110, we achieved our first successful human expedition to the ice worlds of Enceladus and Titan, the moons of Jupiter and Neptune. Word is still out as to whether there's life out there, but there's humans in the far reaches of the solar system. If you remember, the solar sails that we talked about that were simply a theory in 2020 finally set sail for Proxima Centauri in the year 2096. They reached the Proxima Centauri star system on cue 20 years later and beamed their first message back 4.3 years later. And if you do the math, we should be waiting to hear if there's life beyond our solar system this very week. That has been the past 100 years. Thank you for your attention. So that is hopefully a compendium of how we incorporate exponential thinking, as well as current technologies, as well as ideas from science fiction, and plan for the future as we want to see, good, bad, and ugly. So that's not all though, because now it's your turn to predict the future over the next 100 years. So we have 8 of you here today, so maybe in groups of 2 to 3. This is your task for the rest of the class. You will be forecasting the next 100 years. And so the way you're going to do this is you're going to take 2 value systems and plot them on a graph, X versus Y. And then you're going to plot those values according to the 2 extremes of those values. So you'll have a 4-quadrant grid. You're going to look at the different cases that you find on your graph. And then you're going to take look at the pros and cons, and then you're going to take one of your scenarios, whether it's the worst case scenario, whether it's your ideal case scenario, and then you're going to extrapolate how that will evolve over the next 10, 20, 50, 100 years. And so the way to do it, the best way to do it, is to define the state of the art now, define the future that you think you'll see or you want to see in 100 years, and then work backwards. So that's really nebulous, so I put it in an example. So say the two values of the two paradigms that you're looking at are politics and technology. And so on one axis, you'll have two political value judgments, say democracy versus totalitarianism. You know what I'm trying to say. And then technology, looking at, for example, a Luddite world, no technology versus purely autonomous AI. And then you'll plot how those two interact at each end of the spectrum. So here's the graph that, I'll come back to this. This is how much time we've dedicated for each. So here's what a graph of democracy on totalitarianism versus purely autonomous AI versus no technology looks like. And so obviously it's easy to plot the extremes. So if you have a purely totalitarian government that is driven by a purely autonomous AI, you have Skynet, which isn't good. And if you look at the other end of the spectrum, that you have a pure democracy with no technology, essentially you're raising your hand to vote. And then somewhere along on the spectrum, you have a mixed model. So maybe if you're leaning towards democracy, if the future you want to see is a mixed democracy that's empowered by AI, that's on the spectrum, still on a democracy, but a little bit further away from pure democracy, and maybe you don't want a pure AI to avoid a benevolent dictatorship that's run by robots. And then maybe your mixed model, the pros and cons look like using AI to enforce democratic ideals, maintain autonomy, but maybe it's less efficient because you're still incorporating the human factor, but you're also enforcing democracy. So that's what your values map will look like. And then you take that particular value and you extrapolate it. So like we said, define the state of democracy and technology today. And then in 100 years, maybe starting backwards, say you want to define a world where everyone has a say, and maybe we've achieved telepathy, and that direct democracy is simply by beaming your thoughts out to the telepathic voting place. So then what does the roadmap towards that look like? Maybe in 50 years back, there'll be global spread of technology-empowered democracy. Maybe 20 years into the scenario, the model is embraced and normalized, but there's bugs to be ironed out. And then maybe 10 years out, you're looking to empower democracy. We use personal devices to allow for direct participation, but there's lots of bugs to sort out vis-a-vis the Iowa caucuses recently. So that is your task, to work on future forecasting. So I'll maybe let you guys give you a few minutes to form groups. Here is the task, and then we'll give you some time to pick your values, fill in your values, define your scenario, and then present it to the group for questions. Are there any questions on that?
So you should probably mix it up a little bit, like work with somebody that you don't know that well, and you know, you guys can self-arrange however that would look, but that will create, I think, the best outcome, and diversity and multiple points of view.
Oh, and I do have sheets of paper. I meant to bring the page to the board. Didn't work out. So grab a sheet of paper, and then I'm writing implements as well if you need. Oh.
Because there's only two through three.
And you'll just need one sheet of paper per group. And then I'll just remind you of your time.
One sheet from. I'll just kind of.
So just so I know, what are the numbers right now?
I can meet the three of us. Yeah, sure, we can be. I have to picture it every once.
Thank you.
So, what values do you want to pick? Like if we just pick two values, timeline, and like
We could do like,
whatever I think learn and like
privacy.
slides is like we are going to plot
So do you want to do like
scenario, like we have different
how-
techniques and y
I don't know,
axis.
to drive technology or.
do you want to stick
And
with
then,
that?
like we have to compare between technology
Well, like you can
and
choose any
politics
two
and sort of things.
values.
So what do you think of the values that we should look into?
Information sharing versus
Maybe perhaps
proprietary information.
healthcare.
Open source
Yeah.
versus proprietary.
We are like medical professionals, right? So like for us, we don't have a very wide kind of thinking. So like we can think about our own profession,
I don't know what else I
like
could do.
how would medicine be in another 100 years? How would
But we need to find like the
surgical
two
practice for if I talk
values
about
we're
my
trying to
profession,
apply,
like how
and then
would
figure out how
orthopedics
they
and
interact with
spine
different ones
surgery
first.
be in 100 years? Seems like for how would pathology or renal pathology would be in 100 years?
That's another word of like
And for you, like
If we were gonna do
what are your
privacy,
opinions?
what other access?
So I'm in my second year on
I know what you're trying to say.
which sort of classic.
Human
So
relevance.
for you, what do you think would be a very
That's it's kind of a scary way to put it,
Maybe-
but I agree, like that's Yeah.
literature in
But that's
100 years?
Yeah.
Or education in general in 100 years? Maybe education in the medical field could fit in all together.
So privacy versus that we use more.
Yeah.
Sure.
So start plotting. You are the most young and energetic among us. So actually, I come to this class very seldom. So I'm like
You've been wrong.
I don't have very wide.
We could do so education. Now we apply XY graph. So medicine is already done? Yeah.
I would say privacy versus tech,
There should probably be maybe
technology.
our timeline here.
So I guess like
Yeah.
X could be technology or something.
Yeah.
I guess this really
Take
matter.
a
Just like this, technology, because
Then what-
base is more technology, you have to less
Yeah.
privacy, we're gonna that as almost always said, right?
Does it have to be like that?
Not necessarily.
This might end up very similar to
You
like.
can address that as an X, Y
Yes.
graph,
For
so privacy,
So just like.
yeah.
We could just have our access to AI and then privacy can be a function of further.
So first we have to do
Or is that a function
the next 10 years, right?
Okay, so privacy
How
is,
would education?
Wait.
Consequence of no technology.
Or do you think it would be past and then maybe present?
Without technology.
So the first thing I'd actually do is consider not even worry about the time and just worry about doing all the possible
And then
scenarios
what
depending on where
I
you're at
technology.
now.
And then we talk about scenarios.
For example, what is the
Far
opposite
and
of,
it'd be-
And then I'm
you know,
not
what is the
The
ideal
AI
of
takeover or
education
something?
and what is the
purely
opposite
just
of that?
AI.
What is the ideal of medicine and what's the opposite of that? So you're mixing the other into the
Okay, do you want to see the other
and then
access?
start calculating
the
that,
other
like,
access
you know,
is,
medicine, everyone's
well,
healthy all the
privacy,
time
complete privacy
versus,
versus no
you know,
privacy, technology
like
is,
who did in the 1800s.
Human relevance.
no technology to
And then start
Probably,
defining what all of those are.
fairly autonomous AI.
And then what are the scenarios on your graph? And then you extrapolate that.
No, not as
times
fast.
Well, then how would we do no human relevance and no AI?
If you have any
presence?
questions,
Then
let me know.
what happens?
This is
What would be
your.
the opposite of that?
Like, we're gonna break down our society? Is that what we wanna apply?
Yeah, so what I want to do is make this technology,
Like the viruses that they motion.
and this, and would be like AI.
Disaster
Where
viruses. And then this end would be
Or maybe like
with no
the-
tech. But then the
You
function
don't
of
do
this
say
would
about
be
anything about the
privacy.
past, right?
And the function of this would be
This is the present.
you kind of just
I
take
guess
it.
maybe the opposite of nice.
And then you pick something else, and then you determine the inside of this and that. So like we can do like healthcare medicines.
I think I'm not following this as well as you. What are you are, so could you fill? What if you take
Especially
over?
as a function
I'm
of
not sure exactly
if you're
what
looking at
it is.
privacy.
Yeah.
And then just navigation.
I'm such a slow, so.
All right, so you guys should have chosen your values by now. Does everyone have their values chosen?
We're just missing one more.
Okay. Yeah, and then just spend the next 10 to 15 minutes filling in your chart.
So the
Four
opposite of
quadrants
navigation.
would be, so no tech
Yeah.
and bad
It's not
medicine
education.
is like,
Literacy.
Trying to say like,
Wait, what if it ends in healthcare though?
oh, right.
Or maybe.
then no idea. So like literally that means there's like nothing. Like it's just like a void. Are they two like are these two like
Now we have to.
Talk about general.
like
Every 10 years.
like doesn't one kind of imply the yeah.
So it will go from here to here.
The ends of those are easy.
You
Where you have
start from literacy to
complete
from
values.
here.
So,
And
so
then
when
it's
the
in
earth
from here to here.
provides us humans who are the arcane tells us all the
That's also technology versus politics, which is literally what that was.
Alright,
Design
so
trends.
it's when you have climate change versus
What value,
technology.
have you guys
What
chosen?
does this
No.
Well,
say?
technology.
I like
This
technology,
one,
but we
we're kind of
can't-
like,
Yeah, so climate change versus
I don't know.
Yes.
Yeah. There would literally be nothing.
We can just do it.
Mark.
Yeah.
So I feel like it doesn't really, they're kind of like inextricably linked, so you can't really compare them.
Let's start with your one.
So you're looking at
Education
how,
does
humans
So the four
and
quarters, if you have no
more.
technology, no
We are
climate
moving
change,
to like
basically you just
reading through books
world
and
is-
computers and all
Yeah,
sort
so
of
there's-
things. Like maybe
there's no
in 10
AI,
years.
no, well, you could get to a world.
What's there?
Prince
Well,
of
I don't
Books
think
and
you can.
like,
Yeah, I know.
yes
like,
versus humans
reading
scenario.
through
Okay.
No tech.
But you would need to start
No tech, no
somewhere.
climate change.
gadgets.
Most
Like
people
you would
are
need to
like
start
Maybe you
humans
teach
and a lot, then some people
creating an
survive.
AI,
Here we could
so
just
there
put,
has to be some
um,
dependence.
Just living with the world.
Contemporary.
Talk me through this. What
It's
are
up
you
for,
trying to,
like,
what is the, what are you trying to
Just,
develop here?
Just like you said.
Yeah, I
reading.
know, like that, or like some people.
Foundationally, this makes sense.
Like
But
those are
it-
people who
it-
are adapted to like living
Or,
on the
or just like,
land and.
I think this
quick
as a value
change.
judgment.
What do we name the ends
I'm
though?
In the cloud.
What exactly do you
could,
mean by human relevance?
One end could be very warm, the other end could be
Maybe we should pick a
reduced,
specific.
Or it could come.
or we could just
10
do it,
years
you could do it by
after that.
degrees, you could be like
Yeah.
plus 10,
Oh god,
zero.
Everything will be communicated through your brain.
Your
you know.
brain chips through your organism.
Yeah.
Yeah. You can feed your brain with all the
I'll let you
information
guys
that
think
you-
on it a bit
Yeah.
more, and then I'll circulate back.
Range.
Okay,
Yeah.
so
Everyone will be
So no
educated.
tech
Like
and
once
I
they're
like
born.
putting
The
this
technologies will
continue
so
on.
advanced that
Genetic.
we are genetics
continue on what we've been doing so far, which is like literally nothing.
okay.
I think we should still stick with
everyone
Yeah,
should
yeah,
go
I
into
agree.
first. And then the other end is like a green future.
Full of knowledge and
Yeah.
Okay, because it could literally just be anything.
10, 20, 30, 10 years.
Okay,
difference,
so
it's
autonomous
20,
AI.
50.
10, 20,
Along
50
with,
years.
One more?
Yeah.
One more?
continuing on.
Sure.
But I feel like this would be weird because if you have
We can't
autonomous
be more
AI,
advanced than
would they direct the
born
world
with
backwards?
intelligence. What could be more advanced than
Depends what the mission of.
So I guess they stay the same.
Oh, I
And
was
then
thinking that the AI
education.
is
You
self-aware.
can't assume they are good.
Just
Yeah, I guess
assign
we just
that,
need to
like,
wait.
just nothing.
But what would benefit?
All
Okay,
existing
okay, I like
knowledge.
that.
Yeah.
So what
There
would
is
their,
no
what
education.
would their benefit be to total catastrophe?
All the humans die.
Yeah.
Like complete.
But if there's no
enlightenment or
world to
something.
start over, but I guess the AI doesn't
Beyond
really
that,
need like clean
yeah,
water and fresh
it
air.
already reached the genetic
I like
stage,
that.
so maybe
So
this one
something
is
like
most people die.
and,
This one is everyone die.
Oh, so now we
if,
see what
if an AI
happens.
is bad and we continue on our future, an AI might see that we're destroying the world
Okay.
And
and
just let it
see,
happen.
no, see
Everyone-
if
Maybe that's
humans,
what's happening right
Really
now.
but then
good.
they see if humans are the cause and real and
Accelerate.
no, they'll kill the humans.
Yeah,
Same here.
accelerate the
Versions of
path of
yourself.
destruction.
Explore
Okay.
every
No, accelerate the death of humans
that
and
you
path of
gather
destruction.
knowledge.
I'm very
No,
curious as to what you guys are gonna
accelerate
come up with.
I would say the death of humans.
Right?
Yeah, so
Okay.
this is AI kills humans. I like that.
Full/3 higher.
Okay, so then a great future becomes AI would be
And I guess everybody would kind
the AI
Yeah.
corrects us, I guess.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
Yes,
what
the
definitely have to
AI
be.
then takes over. They still become slaves to the robots.
I
But-
would, no,
But feed
Okay.
of those diseases like
They
which
could just be
don't have like
provide
profitability yet, like
the technology we need.
drugs
Actually,
for
The technology is already
Really, I
there.
guess,
The
yeah.
implementation is what's
Yeah.
lacking.
So maybe.
Okay,
so
You
they-
can't argue with that.
They just do it themselves, they're just like, hey, we're gonna do it.
So we become slaves to the robots.
No, they just do it.
I think that everyone is a teacher.
Very optimistic. But no one's complying. Like, where is it? How do you get compliance?
I guess you just have like a
Denying
very
it.
but you
Yeah, we become
also
robo
just start
slaves.
like
That's the end step.
I don't know.
What judgments?
I mean, I feel
So we talked about climate evolution on one axis and technology.
Yeah, everybody
on
else
the same
very
thing,
good.
but
modification
And you just
of
write down
also
filling in the like experts.
Yes.
abnormalities and anomalies so that
Very original.
you don't get I mean like as
yeah,
a human
so
being
teachers,
become
if everyone's like on the same playing field.
give me a scenario where we don't
So,
like
like, I
robots.
feel like
We have maybe
maybe
empirical
like
data
minimum
that said we
levels
have.
of
Because as
AI.
soon as
Robots.
AI becomes
Yeah,
autonomous
maybe
and it's working towards forcing
you don't get the
like
disease.
humans are very
you
destructive.
don't get the
So-
disease and then
The
Yeah.
technology is there.
Yeah, we're gonna
The compliance is what's lacking.
I don't know,
How do you
maybe,
get
How are you guys doing
compliance?
with filling in
maybe
the
AI just
boxes
really
that
loves
started,
humans.
it looks like?
yeah, we're getting
Okay, but the goal is to
still
save the
just
planet, not the
yeah,
humans.
Or you just wanna be left?
We put climate on the axis, not
I
human.
think we want you to catch up a little.
That was my
Yeah,
new
it's difficult. Anything that can be done.
yeah that's
Yeah.
this should be the last
Okay,
one
so
I think
I
so.
would say in a great
Yeah,
future,
no education.
Because
it's just
that
never
ends-
to
Everything.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically.
I don't buy that. I seriously feel like
Any questions about filling in the
Okay, what's the other one?
Yeah,
No,
so
no tag,
we
great
are
future.
simply trying is we are trying to keep things simple from illiteracy to education we're trying
So
to
it'd basically be
follow
like a-
And they
steps
listen.
and in medicine
Yeah,
like
society or
it shows out
Yeah,
about medicine so from incurable disease they're trying to fill up things until the end and that is
I think this would also be most people die.
Very cool.
But we're right.
we are trying to
I
get
read
it
really
don't have
simple
tag.
because
Like now that we like,
Genetic
Oh,
modification.
we have to cut out all tag essentially.
So something has to happen. Yeah, okay, I see.
Like I mean, like we have to, we'll have to cut
So
out.
this,
And then maybe
this
after
is the
genetic
scenario where you
modification,
have
again,
hurricanes and tsunamis
Your
and
cell
people dies
becomes a part of
because
technology.
like the earth climate
Technology
itself.
is
Okay.
really so.
Damn.
I don't think
Things
they're
don't
doing
look so
really
good.
No, they really don't.
Human race.
They really don't.
So everyone just knows everything but AI. Every corner.
I'm just gonna call you Team Doom and Gloom.
Yeah, really.
We're really trying here, but nothing positive is coming up.
So like, are we the one?
Maybe something in between.
Disasters. Yeah.
We would still
incurable
control it,
disease and this can be
Okay.
I guess so, yeah.
So I see what you're saying though.
Yeah, so that's like a.
That's
in terms of medicine what can be
the only way to achieve perfection is to cut out the middleman. Middleman specifically.
detecting your disease without getting any
Yeah,
blood
but what's
tests
the-
or any
yeah,
anything like
Maybe
that.
some,
Can be
very
any
future.
research.
some devices that can like, we
What's
can
the
see
point
people
of,
with
I
the
guess, yeah.
infrared things.
You know, I think most
Like
people have
having
to.
a but like
Diseases.
Okay, so let's
And
try
then
this.
people start living off the land.
You don't
So
technically have to.
So let's do yours for this
Oh, I
corner.
guess so, yeah.
Let's do what you're saying before for this corner.
It's a
Then
happiness.
it becomes, yeah, like this is your optimal,
Won't
So, like,
AI
you
still
have,
technically reach a point where it's smarter than us?
like
So
like
no
a partnership.
matter how much we learn?
But like we would be
Right?
so smart that we can like control their level. Like ultimately, they can't take over because we're just too smart.
So
Will always
if
be
you get a
one
disease,
step.
we
Okay,
find
and this
we
one
find the
becomes,
drugs to or treatment out of
the
the
earth one.
diseases.
Like if
Next step would be like
Advanced.
I think
research.
this one is all people die, and this one is most people.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, you're right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess possibly we
First
educate ourselves through literally just like integrating
of
our consciousness with AI.
the disease become cured.
I think this one happens first and then
Notifications
So
so that
that
nobody
way, like,
gets the
universities
disease.
don't fail, but if you're like super,
And the
super rich,
population
I mean,
you
okay,
can
so the way I see it,
survive one
We
day.
have to explore
Humans
other
basically
planets.
Universities.
stop
Like,
all
university
tech.
exists.
They like stop
Yeah,
everything.
yeah, it's
Education.
They don't burn fossil fuels anymore.
First is illiteracy.
No, that's not
Okay, so
But we're at the exact like we're at the
Yeah, but
like the very end of this.
I see like
so like AI has taken over
Oh,
every
here,
I'm fine with the middle right now.
intellectually.
Okay.
So we don't
Yeah,
really
like we
need
actually go back,
Brain
we
chips.
lose a lot of the technology.
So at that point, would we
But
like
because of
go to
it,
school, or would it just like,
for some people, it's a great future.
So, like, they just need an elementary.
but like wouldn't the AI?
Your human race survive.
Yeah.
Multiple exists.
Okay, so-
So a person can go on and experience everything without actually having to do anything.
Yeah.
Is that on the top or on the
theoretically,
bottom?
the AI just like
That's on
teach
the
it.
top.
Okay, and then what's on the bottom?
Yeah, it's like
There's probably a lot more to it, but
Why does everyone die?
So about 5 minutes left for filling in the plots, and then we'll go to the next part.
Okay, why does everyone die?
Like, let's say there's like some serum
Because
where they can just inject,
irreversibly change the
let's say
planet
after
and
elementary school,
can't get it back.
or after high school,
Mhm.
but like, we would have to put like a limit and like a affordability.
Okay, I see what you're saying.
So everybody can afford it, and that means like university stuff, like it's still there. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So if AI's doing everything, you could pretty much eliminate money.
That's what I'm thinking of like.
So you wouldn't need it,
what
money
kind of,
wouldn't be an issue.
what kind of
Because if AI is doing
education,
everything,
what
you
kind
just
of
create it.
craft would matter?
That's what I'm thinking, right? Because like we don't like
If you can know
We need
everything,
any, like,
what else would matter?
normal like public like structures or like in, yeah.
Okay.
like infrastructure. So you literally just like you're just learning for the sake of learning. Yes.
And then I think this one, yeah, okay, so we're saying.
Right? Because you don't.
They know everything about them, so
But could you?
like
I guess yeah. So it's literally just like
Accelerated by natural disasters.
Yeah, there's no limit,
learning.
right?
Yeah, learning.
Yeah, the universe is.
Yeah, there's no limit to learning. I mean,
AI has
you
taken
can never
over
say
all
that
jobs.
around
Because
everything.
we're doing
it's
like
never possible.
Yeah.
the absolute
We
extremes.
were
of
trying to
each.
learn things which actually affect our life. So besides that, like there's so many things in the universe that
I think I guess so, yeah.
So everybody can just
I think that yeah, at this like
Yeah.
extreme point, we
So
assume
one
that
of the
Putting in
things
AI
here
is
as
just
robo
like
slaves.
AI is
is
everything.
going to affect our
Everything.
life.
Brackets,
or
because
that-
I am still convinced
Yeah,
that this
and
is
like
the
all the
future.
technologies exist, I think. Or like money.
Because because here,
At that
look,
point,
the reason why it's not is because AI can
like Shawna said,
falls
maybe
here.
creativity
the
would.
system
See?
Yeah, and like that basically. Yeah.
Everyone's on
But
the
if
same.
you
I
go
guess.
further, like the very extreme, AI goes up in house world.
Okay.
Okay,
So
so
now
now,
you do evolution.
this is not bad, yeah, okay, let's
So
do
you
evolution now.
Probably don't have dry erase.
Can you read my writing, by the way?
But I guess we just yeah.
So you can handwrite.
The other room is.
Okay, so what's the
Good idea to bring them in, bring some for next class.
Okay, we wanna be-
We're ready to
I
go
think
by the
Actually,
door.
we want
I
to
don't
like,
think I
right?
can control this like
There you are.
right?
Yeah.
So because we have some of the technology that we've created over us.
But-
So that's where we want to be. And so that becomes
Because if AI was run off of those everything. What if like somebody messed up the algorithm and this one AI like wants to become the next
Okay, so we did that.
technology? Exactly.
I think we need to like describe what is that looks like. I guess just AI for the first.
I think it has to
At this point, that saying, the more you know, you realize the less you know.
Yeah.
Or
What happens in
like
50
AI
years?
itself like have its own.
So over the next 2 minutes, you guys should look at the completing your plot fill-ins, and then we'll move into the extrapolation part.
Yeah, that could be.
So 2 more minutes on what you're working on.
Yeah. So that's why.
Okay, so 50 years could be
And then maybe
first autonomous AI.
when we get to different planets
Or
or
just
so,
like-
you know, then we
Yeah.
experience diseases we've never
Yeah,
really
yeah,
experienced.
There's like 3 classes we had saying like we cannot control AI.
And then we're just like,
like
like,
The AI does not have to be.
Basically, if you
You do not have to
think about
program
it,
anything
it's
for
like
it to
a
learn.
lot of investment.
You can learn by itself.
Okay, so in our climate change technology,
all sort of things, right?
Right.
A lot of money
What
goes
is,
into
what will it
these things.
do for
But
technology?
if it
Well, I
was
guess
that
to
easy
be
and
honest, that's the
those countries,
What will it
you
do
see
for
that
climate
people
change?
even don't have access
So
to
I
basic
actually
things.
think,
Yeah.
like taking one step
They
back,
don't have access to clean water. So
looking
our
like 10 years
thinking
in the
would be like
future,
from our
you'll have
perspective,
things like
why do we
machines that will
invest so
go out
much
into
of
the
money
ocean
in
that were already
exploring
developed,
these
Yeah,
that
but
will
if
make a
AI's
high
completely
of
clean
taking
out of the
over,
ocean,
and
like
then
this
spending a lot of money on
like
that.
Yeah, this scenario.
Because like rich
plastics.
countries can
So I think that's the
can
10 years of it.
help
That's
poor countries
Yeah.
develop basic sanitation, basic health
If you have no
facilities.
education,
Once everyone in the earth
If you
are
had
like
education,
basically
yeah.
basically just
Essentially-
equal quality of life, then you can think about things
Slightly
beyond.
autonomous.
So, but you can see a lot of disparity between
Is what we're gonna see in 10
different
years.
different part of the world, right? In our part of the world, like
To
I'm an
clean
orthodox
oceans
surgeon,
and
and now I'm doing pediatric spine surgery. Some kid in my
I
country
guess.
would die without getting operated for scoliosis, and then if we discuss about like going to space and doing this and that.
No, I think oceans will be
Making sense as part of the artificial intelligence AI course that we are thinking on that
I don't know
way.
how it would work.
But for us, like these things.
Well, because I do know that
But also
our,
the problem
like,
connect
If
to
there's nothing to
our
do.
country.
like that'll.
Well, I guess-
And if the basic
So right now,
needs,
we've done that very
so
small scale,
these
like,
things are quite fancy for
like,
us.
like,
But none of these-
Different way of thinking, yeah.
Yeah.
Well, me and my dad were talking about the exact same thing, and he said that,
Isn't the idea that it's just there, AI will solve everything? Actually, no.
the sheepherder in Bosnia is not thinking about what's
Air,
growing in the universe, he's thinking
yeah.
about what he's gonna eat for
Yeah.
himself.
molecules out of air.
That's what I
That are
also think,
detrimental.
like we
That's a
should.
big step.
Yeah, it's a big, yeah.
Okay, I'll put that in 10 years too.
Alright, so we're going to move into the second to last part, I guess maybe the last part before
Basically
presentations. So I want you to take one of your value judgments, some point on your plot, and then extrapolate how that's going to pan out over the next 100 years. So pick a method that works for you, but working backwards as to what it might look like in 100 years and what the evolution towards that. So over the next 10 to 15 minutes, we'll work on that, and then also start thinking about your presentations, because after that, we're going straight into group presentations.
Basically humans.
Maybe not that.
Humans realize
Yeah,
they
I think
Okay,
yeah. I think an example, you could pick like a modern one that was like more ideal.
To a group
Because I think that one should pick.
So recreate maybe this.
Yeah, so that becomes
So like,
more clear to
not,
front end, try to.
so we want more education, not that much AI, basically, yeah. Okay, so like closer to the, like here or here, like directly?
I think more so because we still want some sort of, but not like too much.
So like here. So like in this scenario, oh, but we should, so do we want a
Yeah,
lot
so
of
we can
education?
definitely implement that idea that we just spoke about
Yeah.
in our presentation,
Yeah.
because I think at the end of the day, that's really what
Yeah.
makes the most sense.
Okay,
Yeah, but
So literally like
I
second.
get disappointed because the AI
Right.
class and people in this part of the
Okay.
world thinking this way,
So
and that's possible for
So
them.
at least we can
But
speak
for,
out about
for
education.
so that just start at 100 years.
it's just a fantastic.
Yeah. It's not even a science because we don't.
How do we
Yeah, but
see
like
this panning out?
people
At
like
like the
you
very
are students in AI,
So
this part of the
years,
world can think about all this,
Yeah,
because it's becoming reality, right? People are
Not
going to the
not
space
super
and
genius.
And it's true.
exploring,
A lot
yeah, it's getting
more
there, but I mean, it's not uniform for
Like,
everyone who's living
most
in
of us are
the
pretty smart.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, because when I think about it now, I don't really think about what might be going on in
Yeah,
these
yeah.
other countries or something like that, right? Because it's, we have this sort of foundation set
Yeah.
here and we're like, oh, everything is great.
Yeah.
Yeah, you see like since your childhood, since everything around you, for you like, I mean,
Oh,
what
okay.
it is happening in our part of the world.
I think so, 'cause I
We're unknown, right? We're unknown to those things, so that
progress.
really make you feel that everything that you are not thinking is the reality all over the world, and that's not the situation. Yeah.
It's just
There's
like
definitely
how
lots of progress to be made.
So putting the points that
like
you
before
want
it
to hear,
used to
like,
be, so like in the next 100 years, there's a
put
master's
from
degree.
here, or you just, yeah, you can go up like that.
Teaching in schools, like education equals if I'm a bad teacher in a school and a great teacher in a school, the education is different.
So I can write, AI can be used as like a standardized, effective form of like education regardless of like location.
So folks, maybe we'll have this portion off at 10 minutes, so there's enough time for everyone's presentation. So at 5 after, so maybe 7 minutes from now, we'll
Okay.
cap off.
Okay.
Sure. But I think we should also say, first time say aye.
Okay. I guess we can flesh this out. So that's basically at 100 years. That's what we're at.
But the human are controlling what the education is.
Yeah.
Better real-time monitoring. Better real-time
The entire,
Everything to
yes.
this one there.
So like
50.
a degree
This is
that would
really
be like
optimistic.
useful now
Yeah.
to be considered more like remedial in the future.
Yeah.
Okay,
So like a master's degree now would be like high school education.
Yeah.
got it.
That means we're gonna be in school.
Okay, what are robots doing for us? Yes, you guys are taking vacation.
That's true. That's true.
I mean, the students might not take us.
I'll finish that sentence
What
later.
website is
So then we
it?
have 15
Future timeline.
50 years.
Oh, cool, and what's it about?
It just has like predictions on various things.
So it's like a moderate form of this.
Yeah.
Wait, come back.
21st century, 22nd century, first future,
Future timeline, and is it just like a non-profit?
runs it. But some of the predictions are really interesting, and I'm pretty sure a lot of the past ones, I'm sure.
But like,
Doesn't make sense to me.
So it's a cool
Yeah.
record.
Yeah, cool, thanks for sharing that. I'll stop distracting you.
Different.
I know, we're busy trying to plan it. We're
End of
busy,
civilization,
we're busy being team doom and gloom. I gotcha. Okay, about 5 minutes left, folks.
yeah.
So like, we could say in this school is having cheaper, in this one, should school be free, this one? The 100-year one?
How would AI be created?
Should we combat?
How's it going over there?
Well, I mean, once it's created, you don't have to fund it anymore,
You
right?
got everything?
So
Yeah.
we're
So
saying,
like we're talking that like for the students and AI, I mean like the
Yeah.
thinking process is
Yeah, but that's not
different,
what
right?
But are we like
Because
so
they
like,
can
It is
think
though,
about all
because
those
isn't the
growing
100 years
experience.
your
There's
ideal?
a lot of new
So in order
knowledge
to
and
combat that
with
stress,
feeling
either you-
Yeah,
that
one of her
the background
points was like
came
bug
from
fixing, so we can put that in like 50 years or
even the
something.
basic
Already
requirements,
fine.
facility and everything is
Education.
Okay.
quite
we can put that
difficult
on
for
our
many
plan.
of our
I mean,
countries.
that's
So
Sure.
in that
So
situation,
the idea is to
when
change
you think about
schools.
going to different planet and
Okay, 100
exploring
years.
different
so,
things,
I
it's
guess
like
we-
next to
AI
impossible for us and people
are
in our part of the world. So our perspective of thinking the world is different because we struggle for basic facility, basic
We don't think
handling our
Yeah.
problems. So
we
Oh,
think
of course not.
all these
We think
things,
we're in charge.
I mean,
Oh, of
in
course
our
not.
society would be a good fantasy, all these things.
how cool would it be
For
to
people
live
like him
on a
and other
floating
students
island like
over
that?
here,
I think that would be awesome.
they can think in that perspective, and we are trying to, me and my wife are trying to
But like
think
at
the
least
way
part
they
of
are
it.
thinking, because like for us, it's
Swimming
quite
around it.
difficult to kind of think
I don't know.
exponentially.
Yeah, okay, let's
how
influence
things-
Yeah, so I guess that's by that.
That's why we try to like
AI.
use that in our own field, like we are from medicine, so we
Look,
try
we
to
have to
do
put
on
people
one of the
somewhere.
plot on medicine.
This is
and
another
use
good
for
analogy.
medicine, so
Sense.
it
Yeah,
is
I'm
like
gonna put it
Developed
so
nations.
for us, like for medicine, what we can do, like now we have
Okay, so let's see.
so much of
Let's say that
advanced
all,
equipment,
all
but
levels.
I guess it should be
all
all,
diseases
in
which are
garden
not
manufacturing,
curable, right? So
construction,
the next step
are
will be
control
advancement in
units,
the diagnosis
Okay.
and
So we have
various
and
like high school,
getting new
junior
equipment
high,
that
Sure.
and then 100 years
you,
like
we
right
can
from
get like
there.
Okay.
equipment to incurable disease.
So this would
at
cause,
the
like,
moment,
a
like the way you
lockout,
mentioned
right? Or not a
cancer, right?
lockout, but like
Cancer,
a
disease
increase
can cure.
Gap in
All
education
cancers,
between developed and
you
developing.
can cure one some of them, but
Yes.
most of them, you are prolonging the life.
It'll be fixed
not
somehow.
Yeah.
curing it 100%.
I'm guessing
So the
your
next advancement
tuition
could be
I think this is a good
curing
benevolent
everything
leadership
for all
is like,
cancers
it's a
and
lot
all.
of money that just went.
And the next stage would be
I
like
think
you would modify the
50?
human gene,
We
which
should
you
add-
won't get in
You never
cancer,
said
then
you
get
never
cancer
said
with disease,
literally said that we weren't going to do
And
that.
we're talking about space exploration and all.
I mean, I'm all for it, because I think that's a topic right now, hello
New
Corona.
diseases, new
But-
yeah. And then again, you have to go back to the basics, what the problem is, how to diagnose it, how to get you treated, so the
Basically.
That's really smart. And then the other thing to think about is the similarities between, you know, the places where you can't dream on Earth because the resource limited, but also how the cycle's going to start again in space because it's also resource limited when you start. And so how does a brand new medic base on the moon look like a medical tent in a refugee camp? And how do you need to manage your resources as well? So there's some similarities, as different as they are as well.
Yeah, that's why he gave that idea, cycle return.
It is very similar.
Yeah, that was his innovation.
That's actually a big parallel, between somewhere where you might be from and then you go to space. It's kind of starting from the same basis. But it makes sense to go to space if you could, you already have
So
something.
in the last minute and a half, start wrapping up your projects, think about your presentation. If you want, give yourself a team name, and when you go up, just let me know, remind me of your names, what field of study you're in, and then launch into your presentation. Okay, so 1 more minute.
Data is taken
Okay,
from
I think our
So what is the team name?
instructors around the world or something.
I think our name is
Good
decided
question.
for us.
I mean, you're not committed to it.
Well, considering that you just said that we should introduce a play 50 years in,
I've just been hearing a lot of stuff really. That's all I'm saying.
All of us, right? Your background is American medicine, medical education.
Actually, no, we end up really well. We just. Actually, this is pretty
Oh,
optimistic.
medicine or
It's all the
medicine.
time.
That might be getting too good.
Yeah, so I'll just ignore that. What else do we have for 10 years then?
It sounds one day
you
focus
think it's
on
optimistic?
medicine.
Yeah, okay.
Medicine and research.
Medicine
Okay.
and
So
education.
let's talk
Because
about our
like medical
axes.
education would
Yeah.
make you the medical, right?
Talk about-
It's different.
Do you want to talk about
Medicine
this?
is
I'll talk about the
different.
timeline.
Sure, yeah, that works for me.
We could also promote it as knowledge.
Yeah.
That sounds.
Team knowledge.
It pertains to everybody, but
Yeah.
we took it first.
Yeah.
And time. All right, so we'll give each group 5 minutes, and then if there's time, we'll do a question or two. So who wants to go first?
We'll do it.
All right.
Okay,
The floor is yours.
will you come here or?
I like the
Oh, okay. So I'm Saloni, I'm a master's student in the Department of Surgery.
I'm Cole. I'm an undergraduate student in computer science.
And so we've been named Team Doom and Gloom, and I'm sure you will understand why as we walk through this presentation. So our two axes were technology and climate evolution. So on the technology side, on one end we had no technology, and on the other side we had autonomous AI. And then in terms of climate evolution, on one side we had continue on the same path that we have been, and then on the other side we have a greener future. So when you look at the 4 quadrants, we were guessing that if you have an autonomous AI and you continue on the way that we have been, we expect that all people will die, accelerated with the help of the AI, because that's like the ultimate solution here. When you look at no technology as well as continuing on the same way, we also suspect that everyone will die off, and this will be accelerated by natural disasters like we're seeing right now, a lot of hurricanes, tsunamis, earthquakes. We also expect to see things like water shortages, and you'll see a lot of climate change migrants, similar to the way that we're seeing economic migrants, again accelerating the path to death. If we have no technology and a greener future, we would expect that, again, most people will die, but survivors will be living off the land. There'll be a lot of self-sustenance, and then a reversion to the hunter-gatherer type lifestyle. And so our optimal scenario then is a scenario where you have a greener future as well as an autonomous AI. And so the extreme here is like robo-slaves. So we all follow our robot overlords and we do what they tell us to do. But the time point that we picked was a little bit more benevolent than that, and so we picked a point where you would have an AI-human partnership scenario. And so
and yeah, just the autonomous AI and continue one corner where everyone dies. The AI will kill us is what we're expecting, because they realize we're the ones that are destroying Earth. So that's why we die. And no tech and a greener future, That one, everyone dies because we realize we have to get rid of a lot of modern conveniences that are destroying our planet, and because of that, we can't sustain the populations we've grown. So our timeline, 10 years from now, we have autonomous machines which are cleaning the oceans of microplastics. We need to plant a ton more trees, and humans kind of realize that they've made a mistake. So this is pretty optimistic. 10 years from now, I don't know if humans are going to actually get their act together. In 20 years, large-scale carbon removal from the atmosphere, and nations commit to only using renewable energy. 50 years from now, all nations achieve 100% renewable energy, so a carbon neutral footprint. We get first fully autonomous AI, and we have real-time monitoring of our entire planet with satellites. 100 years from now is when the AI are smart enough to control most things on the planet and function it so our planet survives nicely. We'll have a bunch of floating cities because our water level rose a lot and our population is still very high. And any decisions on manufacturing or construction are all controlled by our AI overlords. Yeah.
So did you consider about taking it one step further and making the AI truly integrated so that the AI and human are kind of like cyborgs, so you're minimizing the waste as well as the energy needs of the human?
We don't think this will happen in 100 years. We're not that optimistic.
Fair enough.
That's really interesting though, for sure.
Any other questions at all? Lots of fodder to discuss over dinner and or wine tonight. All right, good job, you guys. We will go around the room to, not sure what you guys are calling your team.
We don't have
We don't
to-
really have a team name. Sure. So the two value judgments that we chose were
Don't forget your introductions, names, what you study.
right.
I remember some of your guys' names.
I'm Hannah, I'm a Master's of Science student with primary surgery.
I'm Kevin. I'm in my third year of honors cell biology.
Hi, my name is Emily. I'm in my third year of immunology and infection.
Yeah. So the two value judgments we chose to think about were basically the presence of AI and also the value of education in society. So the kind of two extreme points we chose for each was this first for education, a society wherein it has basically no presence, no one gets any education at all, ever. And then on the other end is basically everyone has a complete commitment to education or is basically seeks to achieve, I guess, spend the rest of their life in like the total pursuit of knowledge. And then for AI presence, one would be absolutely none, so just basically nothing. And then the other would be a society in which AI has completely taken over and basically restructured how we live our life. So at the intersection where there's no AI presence and also no education, we would anticipate something that would be kind of like a total societal regression. It'd be something like a return to like a hunter-gathering society or like an agricultural society. On the other hand, if we had no AI presence and then a society that really values just the pursuit of education, we would basically have the majority of the job force being focused on being educators, so teachers, professors. Because of that, you'd probably expect some kind of breakdown of a lot of the way our society is structured because there'd be no more or not enough people available to fulfill really integral tasks that aren't involved in teaching. In terms of complete AI takeover, if there was no value in education, we would basically just kind of exist under AI without really much critical thought or just kind of submit to it. And then on the contrast, if we had complete AI takeover and also large valuing in education, you basically have AI maybe integrating with us as some kind of form of like the integration between our brains and AI as basically an ultimate acquisition of knowledge, or maybe it being replacing humans as educators.
So the time point we chose was kind of like in between, a little closer to complete AI and kind of the same education level we have now, except throughout time we'll advance, like, so a high school education would be more like a bachelor's degree, and then it'd become more like a master's degree. So at 10 years we would see AI being phased into like top institutions as the teachers like teaching at like MIT or Oxford, to see if it works, kind of a trial period, and people would still be very skeptical of if it could work or not, and it's only accessible to a select few individuals. And then at 20 years, AI would be used to
As a teaching assistant.
as a teaching assistant in post-secondary institutions, so just to keep it at the higher education, and the tuition would increase because it's obviously going to be more expensive.
So at 50 years, it's going to be used as an assistant from about like the junior high, high school, and post-secondary institutions. And higher education is becoming increasingly available because they found a way to resolve the cost of implementing AI into the post-secondary education. And then in 100 years, AI is used as an effective teaching form in all forms of education, so kindergarten all through post-secondary. And education is free at this point, and degrees are becoming increasingly advanced. So in after you finish elementary, that's equivalent as to like a PhD at that point. Yeah.
Question, so kind of based on you correctly identified tuition as an ongoing issue until we can overcome that barrier, do you see a socioeconomic stratification and disparity emerging from that? And then do you think there will also be a time lag in which, we get those groups that are disproportionately affected, trying to catch them up?
Yeah, something that I was going to write down on this, but then forgot, was that, say, at around like the 20-year mark, when AI would be used as an effective teaching assistant, and say, like, more commonly, we would expect it to show up first in like extremely developed nations, or basically ones with a lot of resources, whereas developing nations would basically have nothing. So there'd be a large disparity between education levels. But we would hope in an ideal society, and 30 years later, we would hopefully develop the technology to have it be much more affordable, accessible, and have no kind of barriers in technology and like resources that would prevent these developing nations from then seeing that education and kind of bringing them up to the same level.
And then the other caveat about that is also to respect the autonomy of every single group, because there's groups who are fiercely protective of their culture. So often we see this with Indigenous people in Canada, saying we're going to help them with healthcare and technology, but also we have to respect the autonomy that they want to preserve their way of living. Or you look at, for example, the Mamo tribes in Brazil that are typically untouched, like, far from humanity. So also think about how disparity is going to evolve because of cultural preservation. So it's really interesting how technology capabilities can evolve, but humans are going to humans. So we can't always force technology adoption. Any other questions at all, comments, concerns? All right, so then in the last 5 minutes, we'll go to the last group. Go for it, introductions, team name if you have one, and presentation.
All right, so our team name is Medicine and Education, or just a broader term, knowledge. My name is Amir, I'm a second-year classics student.
I'm Pooja, and I'm fellow on the Dr. Kim Solis. I'm renal and transplant pathologist.
I am Beacon, I'm an orthopedic surgeon doing pediatric spine fellowship at the AFA.
Okay, so yeah, our two axes were education and medicine, and I guess we'll just go about it in a linear fashion and then tie the two in together. So we'll start off with medicine.
Yeah. So we've taken medicine, and the first thing the least thing that could happen is like presence of many incurable diseases that are there. So with the advancement of time, many advanced detection technologies will be available, and many diseases could be detected in early stages, or maybe with advanced devices that we have, that we can see temperature and all such devices may be formed, and we can easily detect many diseases. And then with later, these diseases may be curable. There are many incurable diseases like cancer. So only few cancers are like curable and some are not. So maybe with technologies and advancement, many diseases will be curable. And maybe within 100 years, genetic modification can be done on an unborn child, and these modification can erase many diseases. And
Yeah, basically if we look into the time frame, what would happen in next 10, 20, 50 and 100 years, I would like to repeat whatever she said. At this moment in time, we are pretty good in medicine, but there are so many things that are not under our control. So there are so many diseases which we cannot cure completely. So with the help of AI, maybe in another 10 years, we would be more sophisticated, and we would be diagnosing diseases more precisely. Like we do blood tests and all other sort of tests at this moment to diagnose many things, but with the use of AI, we can use a simple device or a scanner kind of thing, and you can diagnose diabetes or hypertension or so many other complex diseases. And in the same fashion, in another 20 years, we can do genetic modification. If someone is high risk for certain disease, then we can look into the genome and then modify the genome of that person, and then kind of prevent that person from getting the disease in. So that can be done with the help of AI. And then in next stage would be we go to the different planet, and then we go to moon, we go to Mars. We'll have a lot of people around. At this moment we are only at the experimental stage, right? We have a couple of people in the planet, but when you will have millions of people in the planet, imagine your Earth is vanishing, everything is running short. When you go to new planet, then everything will repeat again. You'll have new problems emerging, you'll have new diseases emerging, and at that stage we won't be knowing anything in that situation. So we'll go back to the next cycle where you would start the way we started a couple of 100 years back, and it will keep on rotating like that. That's what we think about. I think our friend will explain about his thinking on education.
Yeah, so for education, we're starting off with illiteracy. And from that, maybe moving on into kind of how we learn now through reading textbooks and studying in the classroom and whatnot. And then maybe perhaps from there we jump on into brain chips, which I think are being developed now. And from there move on to genetic modification, and then as Dr. Solos once discussed, having multiple versions of yourself, so you can experience everything without actually having to do anything, and gaining knowledge and wisdom through that, in that sense. And then perhaps this is kind of where we can parallel medicine and education, or just knowledge as a whole, in that we'll probably reach a point where we probably know everything in regards to what there is on Earth, and we'll expand from there and through space exploration or something, and we'll be back at that point where we once knew nothing.
But
yeah.
the three of us think that this is only in the context of developed countries like Canada and US, but scenarios in our country is a bit different. There are still healthcare that are not met, and even education. Most of the children, they don't go to school. They don't have basic things to go to school. So I don't think much will change in our scenario, even in 100 years. So things are different. The scenario is different. This is the scenario of these countries, but we have different scenarios. So maybe.
And he rightly mentioned about in another 20, 30 years, there won't be any barrier to knowledge and technology to different part of the world. So people in the developing world would also have the same access to knowledge and technology. I think that is the most important thing, and universities like this should also collaborate with people of the universities back in the developing world, so that the students in that part of the world also get access to similar kind of thought process and similar kind of facilities that you guys are doing out here, because the situation is different, everything you need a lot of resources and all. So that would be a great thing if we can collaborate and then spread knowledge all over the planet first, and then go beyond it when everyone on the earth would have a same quality of life.
Perfect, well done. So, that's time. So by way of wrap up, over these past 4 lectures, my hope is that you've been given tools for knowing what technologies exist currently, how to extrapolate and think exponentially and plan for the future, and also that's relevant to your respective fields, whether it's computer science, immunology, medicine, surgery, pathology, and that you have tools that you're equipped to utilize in your everyday lives. So that's it for me from this class. You have my email address if you have any questions. I will be at dinner tonight at 6 p.m. at La Ronde under Dr. Solis' name.
Yep.
So that's class. Thanks very much for your attention.